If someone had handed me a piece of paper at 20 years old and said, "What do you want to do in your life?" I think I would have put some things on that paper that my life has not included. At 24, I was going to drive a little red sports car, be a clinical speech pathologist. Had my life figured out, that life would have included children, but not the 8 children that the Lord eventually gave us. So it's been full of surprises. The Lord has brought many things into my life I did not know were going to be there. I got married when I was 20 years old, and Billy and I had dated for a long time, had been engaged for a year and a half, and we were just ready to get married. If you had asked me to define biblical womanhood or what it meant to be someone's wife, about what my responsibility was as someone's wife, I would not have given that a lot of thought. I just knew I was in love with him and I couldn't wait to be married. And that was about as far as my thought process went. As I got into my mid-30s, I was pregnant with my 4th child. I was caring for my mother-in-law who had Alzheimer's and had 4 little children, and it was just a really excruciating season of life. And really I was okay earlier on when some hard things came into my life because they ended and there was an ending point to them. But this began really an extended period of time, years, where it was hard. And there were days when I can remember sitting in my closet, which was about the only place I could get any privacy, and saying to the Lord, "I'm sorry, but I just don't think this is possible." And what I learned was that God did not go away in those tough moments, that He was still there, that He was very present. And so much of what I believe now was really worked into my life, beginning in those years where it suddenly got hard, didn't fit who I was or who I thought I would be at 20 or at 30. But as the Lord kept us in that school for many years, it became precious to me, because that's where I learned who God was. And so those very, very tough moments became very precious.
Well, I think Holly has, as both of us have, grown and matured through the years in our marriage in dramatic ways. I think one of the primary ways that I see is her embracing the sovereignty of God about our life, the circumstances of our life. And I think the difference between that 20-year-old girl that I married and the girl that I have now, and I'm not going to mention her age, but is the fact that there is a depth of biblical conviction and an understanding of the truth and a seasoned, matured faith that only comes through going through difficulty.
In Titus 2, when Paul writes to Titus and he says, there's a problem here. You have people who are coming into the church and they're teaching philosophies that are not correct. And so you have church members now who don't have the understanding you want them to have. And so they don't have behavior that matches their belief. And so that's got to be corrected. And that's, as I look back, that's what God did in my life in those decades of my 20s, my 30s, my 40s. God was correcting my belief system so that my behavior could live out what He desired for me. And what God had to do was take the foundation I had, which was a good one, but it was incomplete because it wasn't the big picture. And so when I look at Titus 2, it's not a Tea Party philosophy to me. It is about women who are courageous enough to go to God's Word to say, what do you desire for me as a wife, as a mother, as a single?
To my mom, what was most important was us, and what was most important was loving us and teaching us what it meant to be God's child and what it meant to live that out.
You know, ever since I was little, I've always wanted to be a wife and a mom, and I think one of the things is that my mom was home, and being able to see that she devoted her life to raising us. And I think that my mom just always showed us that, especially having 8 children, that that children really are a blessing, and they're fun, and they're worth it. Mm-hmm. And even though you don't get sleep and stuff, it's worth all of the sacrifice and all of the hard things you go through. And she wasn't always perfect, but for me to see that growing up and realize that children are a valuable thing and they're a treasure. And I think a lot of girls my age don't see that because it's just not important in our culture, that children are more of a burden than a value. But I think that my mom just always showed us that what she was doing with her life was worth it,
I think what the Lord has shown me in the last decade is the critical nature of looking ahead but leaving behind us a legacy. There are things that are not just about me. There are things that are not even just about what I want my children to know. But in a sense, there are things that are large, much larger than I am, things that I would love for women in future generations to know and understand about the Lord and His calling on our life as women. And it's such a privilege now, looking back over decades of God teaching me that truth, it is such a privilege now to be able to share why it matters. And that the call to biblical womanhood is not about doing a right set of things. It is about understanding God's heart for women in this nation. And so as we exemplify God's Spirit, His personality, through our lives as we are wives and mothers or single women following the call of God, we're exemplifying to a watching world who God is.